On March 3, 2025, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a stark warning to Hamas, the militant group that controls the Gaza Strip. He demanded the return of all remaining Israeli hostages held by Hamas. Netanyahu warned of dire consequences if Hamas failed to comply. "We will take actions you cannot imagine," he threatened. Netanyahu's warning came amidst a fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. The ceasefire, which began 6 weeks prior, had already begun to crumble. The situation was further complicated by the approaching deadline for the next phase of the ceasefire agreement. The clock was ticking and tensions were rising. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant echoed Netanyahu's sentiments, using even more forceful language. "The gates of hell will open if the hostages are not returned," Gallant warned. The message from Israel's leadership was clear. The release of the hostages was non-negotiable, and they were prepared to take extreme measures to ensure their return. The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas had been agreed upon 6 weeks earlier in an attempt to end a bloody conflict. As part of the initial phase of the agreement, Hamas had released 25 living hostages and the bodies of 8 deceased individuals. In exchange, Israel had released 1,800 Palestinian prisoners. However, this exchange had done little to quell the underlying tensions. The ceasefire was structured in phases, with each phase building upon the last in hopes of a lasting peace. The first phase, which focused on the exchange of prisoners and hostages, was set to expire on March 2nd. As the deadline approached, it became increasingly clear that the two sides were nowhere near an agreement on how to proceed. Israel refused to move forward with the next phase of the agreement, which involved easing the blockade on Gaza and allowing much-needed aid into the region, until all remaining hostages were returned. Hamas, on the other hand, seemed unwilling or unable to meet this demand. With neither side willing to budge, the ceasefire was on the verge of collapse. Faced with the looming deadline and Hamas's intransigence, Netanyahu came under intense pressure to take decisive action. The families of the hostages, desperate for the return of their loved ones, demanded that Netanyahu take a hard line with Hamas. They accused him of not doing enough to secure the release of the captives. Protests erupted across Israel, with families of the hostages leading the charge. They marched on the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, demanding answers and accountability. The protests sometimes turned confrontational, with scuffles breaking out between demonstrators and security forces. Adding fuel to the fire, some members of Netanyahu's own right-wing coalition began to criticize his handling of the situation. They urged him to abandon the ceasefire entirely and launch a full-scale military operation to crush Hamas and liberate the hostages by force. Netanyahu, however, seemed determined to exhaust all other options before resorting to such extreme measures. The rapidly deteriorating situation in Gaza drew the attention of the international community, with various actors stepping in to try and salvage the ceasefire. The United States in particular played an active role, with U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff engaging in shuttle diplomacy between Jerusalem and Gaza City. Witkoff's efforts were primarily focused on persuading Hamas to release the remaining hostages and urging Israel to show some flexibility in its demands. The international community recognized the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza due to the blockade and urged Israel to allow aid into the region. The situation remained precarious, with the potential for a renewed outbreak of violence looming large. The outcome of the crisis hinged on a number of factors, including the willingness of both sides to compromise, the effectiveness of international mediation efforts, and the internal dynamics within both Israel and Hamas. As the world watched with bated breath, the fate of the hostages and the future of the region hung in the balance.